Welcome to Japan Unleashed. Welcome back to Japan Unleashed, where we take a deep look into important issues facing Japan. I'm your host, Parker Allen, President and CEO of Parthenon Japan. This episode of Japan Unleashed is the third in a 6-part series on Japan's regional revitalization. I am joined again today by my good friend, fellow Japan specialist, strategic communications specialist, Parthenon Japan senior advisor, and co-contributor to this series, David Wagner. David, thank you so much for being a part of this program.
Hey, Parker, thank you. And question, what can the Japanese government do to revitalize the countryside here? Can they do it alone? Can they do it with some additional help? These are the kinds of questions we want to talk about today.
You know, so far we have been looking into some of the challenges that Japan needs to overcome in order to make rural revitalization a reality. Previously in this series, we discussed Japan's struggle to achieve energy independence, as well as the real estate realities that discourage people from owning rural property. Clearly, these challenges cannot be overcome without government intervention. But that's not to say that the government of Japan hasn't been trying. First, let's take a quick look at some of the initiatives that have been undertaken by the Japanese government to spur growth and invigorate rural areas. Let's address some of the key questions. For instance, what has the Japanese government been doing in order to invigorate growth in rural areas? Also, have these initiatives been effective? In addition, what else should the government consider embarking upon to bring people back to the Japanese countryside? To address these vital questions, first we have to circle back to the basics.
First, depopulation is undoubtedly the biggest threat. Japan's population peaked at 128 million in 2010, and 13 years later, we're headed on a negative trajectory. Depopulation has dire economic, social, political, and cultural consequences for Japan, and Japan's labor market is already starting to suffer. Companies located in rural areas, especially small and medium-sized firms, are struggling to keep business going because they don't have enough people. If this downward spiral continues, how is Japan going to keep its economy going?
Japan's low birth rate, aging population, and limited immigration certainly aren't helping the situation. Japan's leaders know this, but we wonder, what are they going to do about it? What can be done to reverse this negative trajectory? What might help influence young, ambitious Japanese people in rural areas to stay in their hometowns? And on the flip side, what might motivate young urban Japanese to move to the countryside? While there have been some well-intentioned policy undertakings by the Japanese government, thus far they have not managed to make a meaningful impact.
Well, it's better than nothing. In fact, the Japanese government has launched various strategies to establish and foster both a sense of reliability and self-reliance among young people. But I haven't seen much in attempting to make agriculture and farming appealing to young people. Perhaps financial incentives would help. Putting depopulation aside for a moment, a number of government-led programs exist, and they are designed to revitalize Japan's countryside with the objective of enticing young people to embrace rural living. While few initiatives single out repopulation directly, which is honestly something that the government cannot control, I would like to point out some of the key initiatives designed to foster economic growth. And one of the enormous efforts is the quote-unquote New Tohoku program, encompassing the entire region devastated by the massive earthquake and tsunami of 2011. This initiative, launched by Japan's Reconstruction Agency, is a joint collaboration among NPOs, universities, local governments, and the private sector. And it's intended to reinvigorate the regions impacted by 2011, the disaster that accompanied it and wiped out entire cities. After clearing areas destroyed by the disaster, which itself was a massive undertaking encompassing 561 square kilometers across 62 municipalities in 6 prefectures, they proceeded to reconstruct entire villages, towns, and even large sections of cities.
While I myself was amazed at the scale of the reconstruction effort, having visited Otsuchi village in Iwate Prefecture in 2017, after much of the work had already been completed, seeing the sight of brand new road networks circling around endless empty plots brought tears to my eyes. The fact of the matter is that rebuilding does not resolve the issue of bringing evacuees and industry back to these regions to reestablish sustainable communities.
According to the Reconstruction Agency, about 470,000 people were displaced in 2011. But today, less than 30,000 remain in temporary housing, and that's good news. However, even though the agricultural and seafood industries have largely been restored as radiation safety concerns have been addressed and land has been cleared from debris, a staggering 340,000 people, or 72%, left the region entirely. 12 years later, most have not returned.
And there are some indicting examples that exemplify how the government rebuilt disaster-stricken communities with noble intentions, but they have been unsuccessful in getting people to resettle or move there. For instance, Rikuzen Takata City in Iwate Prefecture was hit by a massive tsunami of up to 17.6 meters after the Great East Japan earthquake, completely destroying large swaths of the city. Of the approximately 23,000 residents of the city at the time, more than 1,700 people lost their lives. In Rikuzen Takata's Takata and Imaizumi districts is a newly rebuilt district of about 300 hectares. 40% of the land has been raised more than 10 meters, making this one of the massive reconstruction projects in the disaster-stricken areas. The amount of investment is also massive, about 150 billion yen for about 2,200 landowners. If you do the math, that's 68 million yen, or about 500,000 US, per household. However, only about 30% of the land is being used or has plans to be used. This makes the numbers even more stark. In effect, the government spent 227 million yen per utilized parcel. That would buy you a massive house in Tokyo. Was that an effective use of taxpayer money? Unfortunately, it's hard to say yes.
Well, this begs the question, can the ongoing Tohoku reconstruction effort bring people back to the affected regions? Tohoku's revitalization is unique among Japan's struggling regions, as it had a huge disaster that happened amidst the population as a whole. Rebuilding Tohoku is a multi-decade effort, and the investment is massive. But the national government bankrolling this initiative only goes so far, and it is true that the government has spent 40 trillion yen, or 293 billion US dollars, on recovery efforts since 2011, with 13 trillion yen going to construction of permanent housing and rebuilding infrastructure in disaster-affected towns. And we're just talking about the Tohoku region here. What about other regions of Japan?
You know, I want to go back to the Tohoku example for a second, because the numbers are just so bad. I was looking into a similar situation to Rikuzen Takata in Ogatsu Village, which is part of Miyagi Prefecture's Ishinomaki City. In a built-up area in the Bunuhama district overlooking the sea at more than 20 meters above sea level, there is a spacious residential area where only one house was built as of 2020. And this is a common problem facing these two communities, that the population is just declining at a faster than expected rate. There are just under 18,000 residents of Rikuzen Takata City as of January 2023, which is over 20% less than the population on March the 1st, 2011, right before the disaster. Even worse than that, Ogatsucho has just over 1,000 residents as of the same date, January 2023, which is a 75% decrease from the pre-disaster population of 4,300 people. This combination of population decline and people's lack of inclination to resettle or move to areas that were devastated makes me wonder what the government's intention was by creating these severely underutilized communities at great expense.
Well, Japanese leaders know they have a huge problem on their hands, which spans rural areas across the nation. And I guess the question is, how can the government of Japan spur sustainable growth that benefits the countryside as a whole? And the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe made a rural revitalization plan as part of his Keystone Three Arrow initiative. His goal was to stimulate growth across Japan through monetary easing with the help of the Bank of Japan, fiscal stimulus driven by ambitious government spending, and structural reforms, which is where regional revitalization comes into play as a whole. And in fact, Abe coined the term regional revitalization in a 2014 speech and named minister in charge of the effort as a whole. The Japanese government's strategy is consistent. Support at the national level, accompanied by determined regional efforts. Central to this plan are councils on regional industrial competitiveness at the local level, which form a base to streamline decision-making.
So, how does it work? Collaboration is key. Part of this goal is to entice new investment through private finance initiatives, or PFI, and public-private partnerships, or PPP. PFIs are given infrastructure concessions, while PPPs offer private sector business opportunities. This combines with additional efforts such as the government's National Strategic Special Zone program. These zones aim to enhance economic growth by implementing regulatory reforms with the goal of promoting the idea that there is no place better to do business than rural Japan.
Indeed. I mean, business-friendly regulatory programs, such as offering tax incentives for programs carried out jointly by the central government, local government, and the private sector, are meant to achieve that goal. And in April 2020, the government reported over 100 reforms that incentivized 350 projects. You know, it's hard to determine overall effectiveness, but this is definitely a step in the right direction. And additional help comes from Japan's Regional Revitalization Act, which went into effect in 2016. You know, it provides government subsidies for local revitalization projects, again, through tax incentives, to private sector organizations that donate funds to local projects. And it sounds good on paper, but, you know, who will carry out the work? And will these efforts entice young families to leave urban areas?
This is a good question. A recent initiative, the Regional Revitalization Support Program, offers participants a chance to try rural life with financial incentives of up to 4.8 million yen per person as resettlement offsets. Japan's Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications has also established municipal panels that provide additional options to draw more applicants to their regions. But with a 2024 participant target of just 8,000 people, that really just doesn't move the needle.
No, not at all. And another challenge comes from having accurate data from which regional decision makers can reach the right conclusions. Japan's government created the Regional Economy and Society Analysis System, or RESAS, I don't know if you pronounce that RESAS or not, as a way of better providing big data in a timely manner. RESAS analyzes regional scenarios and helps set realistic development targets, which support public and private sector entities to make more fully informed strategic decisions. This should help fill the data gap existing between and among many players pertaining to regional economic, demographic and financial issues.
And actually, right before we started this episode, I took a look at RESAS, and it's actually a really amazing system. I was impressed.
Well, so some of the things they're doing are working. So all of these programs beg a lot of questions. If Japan is going to keep young people in rural areas and entice transplants from urban areas, how's it going to work? So let's talk about unemployment, for example. Despite Japan's strong economy, young people must surely worry about finding stable employment in areas where there's a lack of job opportunities as a whole. Parker, any thoughts on that?
Yes, and of course, as with most issues that we're facing in this series, it is a complicated problem. Obviously, as people have by and large already left these rural areas, the fact of the matter is there are limited job opportunities. In a lot of these small municipalities, the largest employer is the local government.
That's right.
And so, given that situation, local employment opportunities are limited. And without more private sector investment in building facilities, factories, satellite offices, and other concerns in these rural areas, there aren't going to be any local jobs for people. However, we should also think about the promise of working from home and remote work, which of course would enable people to live wherever they want and do the job that maybe they got in Tokyo, Osaka, or Nagoya.
Yeah, and I mean, hybrid work versus totally remote work. I think hybrid has taken hold in Japan as a whole, but totally remote work is still, depending on the field, not really accepted as a whole. And then there's the issue of economic instability. You know, with the high cost of living in urban Japan, many young people surely are concerned about being able to afford housing, healthcare, and other necessities in the future, which on the flip side makes rural areas more appealing. Parker, you have any thoughts on that?
You know, I definitely think that when it comes to cost of living and quality of life, rural areas offer a lot more than people think. There is infrastructure there, while, of course, due to limited budgets, the infrastructure sometimes isn't as good as it might have been in the good old days, but it is there and it's underutilized. So, you know, if you want to go to a hospital in Tokyo, I mean, you could be waiting for hours. If you go to a hospital in rural Japan, you can get right in there.
Yeah, you can get right in there, but I'll tell you a story. I was hot tubbing with 3 or 4 friends a number of years ago, and it was a Saturday night at 8 o'clock. We went back to the car, and one of them looked in the rearview mirror at his eye and was losing his eyesight. And there we are on a Saturday night in Izu, 30 or 40 minutes from Izu City, with an inability to communicate and know what to do. So it probably wouldn't take 30 or 40 minutes to get a hospital here, although the issue in the urban areas is a little bit different, of rejection of the hospital of the ambulance for a variety of reasons: lack of staff, lack of doctors, lack of beds, whatever the issue is. Anyway, all of that aside, there is the topic of demographic change. And as Japan is aging rapidly, we have to ask the question, what are the long-term economic and social impacts of this demographic shift?
This is huge. I mean, when it comes to looking at Japan as a whole, even while Japan's economy is growing and companies in urban megacenters are making record profits in some cases, the fact of the matter is, with all of these rural governments running in the red, the national government is having to bankroll all of this. And so, thinking about the fiscal impacts of this demographic shift, it's very bad news for the government. And honestly, it's also bad news for Japan, because if you think about this country with over 2,000 years of history all across the country, don't you want to see those communities across Japan to continue to exist in some sort of sustainable format? I think that's something that a lot of people want to see, but more people need to make it their own problem and realize that if some people don't start embracing alternative lifestyles and moving out to the countryside, they're going to be part of the problem, and these communities are going to disappear. And that beautiful, awesome local culture that's existed for centuries and millennia will also go with it.
Well, it's a modern problem. And another problem that's related to it is social isolation. Do the long hours and demanding nature of work in Japan lead to feelings of loneliness and disconnection in urban and in rural areas? And what does this do in terms of decision-making for where you live? I think it's an acute problem, certainly for the rural areas, much more than even the urban areas where there's a lot more to do. Any thoughts on that?
I have way too many thoughts on that. I'm going to try and compress them, but when it comes to loneliness, disconnection, and of course, we can't really talk about these two things without touching on mental health. I think the pandemic has brought a lot of long-standing issues in Japan to the surface. One thing that I particularly like about rural areas is the existence of tight-knit communities and this greater sense of getting to know people who you might not have any connection with, but you just say hello. You might meet them at the local bar or izakaya, and you can really develop networks of new friends if you're that kind of person. But it takes the right kind of personality to go out there and meet people and sort of get yourself involved in that social scene. And for outsiders, it can feel difficult, and sometimes it actually is difficult depending on the community. There was a recent Asahi article which actually mentioned a person who had moved to a very rural community with the best intentions, but they weren't accepted by the locals, and they felt like they made a terrible decision.
Well, this is a larger issue, and we're going to cover this in one of our future topics when we talk about immigration and migration. But I agree with you. It's a huge issue. And another one related to that is career opportunities, as you've touched on a little earlier. Are young people getting the education needed to sustain long-term employment? And it's not just a problem for people in any urban or rural area. It's a global issue. Today's skills, will they be tomorrow's skills? And how do you do that and plan for that when you're living in a place that's depopulating?
That's a very good question. And I've actually been quite surprised pleasantly by how Japan's education system is shifting. There are initiatives to teach more things that are STEM or coding related, even in a very basic way from elementary school. And talking about, education, is there a gap between the quality of education in rural versus urban areas? Honestly, the reality of the matter is that it depends on the school. And there are great public schools in urban areas, and there are terrible public schools in urban areas.
Well, it's the same in every country, right? We come from the United States. It's the same issue, correct? But then we add to that technology, and we're going to talk about technology in the next thought leadership piece and podcast. But just to touch on it briefly, I mean, today's technology is not tomorrow's technology. Look at ChatGPT. And the whole issue of coding is going to be automated. So people studying to be coders now, will they even have a job in 5 years? So I don't know how you plan for the future. It's a huge issue. And if you ask the question, is the shifting international landscape even on young people's minds? I mean, what are they thinking about? Are they thinking about today's technology and tomorrow's technology? Are they thinking about what the political landscape will look like when you're surrounded by Russia, North Korea, and China, which don't particularly care for you? I don't think they're thinking about it. What do you think?
Well, unfortunately, on that point, I have to agree with you. Japan's general interest in international affairs is, I would say, relatively low. While you do see it on the news, it just seems like a faraway foreign problem. And we're not really seeing Japanese young people embrace the idea of international education, learning English, and of course other languages in addition to that, and really sort of developing that global mindset. And we see some of it here in Tokyo, but I think it is more difficult for people in rural areas to get that international perspective being so far removed from it. So, in that sense, that's something that I think the government and the education system needs to step up. I mean, civics education is so underdeveloped in this country. Literally, young Japanese people don't know how the government works. College graduates don't know how the government works.
I bet in the rural areas they know better than in the urban areas. I bet you money on that, and I bet you that's the truth everywhere. They spend more time studying, is my guess.
Well, you've got more time to study when you don't have all of these interesting shopping opportunities around you. So it's an interesting question. And, one thing I think that is directly connected to this is just more young people need to get interested in politics. We had that blip when we had the Sealeds, there were those protests against the Collective Defense Act back around, 2015? And there was sort of a flash in the pan of young civic-minded people, but you don't really see much of that these days. And I think your average person on the street, they kind of sort of hear about what's going on in Japanese politics, but they don't really understand it.
Yeah, that's fair enough. That's fair enough.
All of these government efforts are a big step in the right direction, but can these initiatives be maintained or even fully realized? To be truly impactful, municipal and regional governments need to offer and effectively promote available services that compare with those offered in urban areas. High-quality healthcare facilities such as clinics, hospitals, and assisted living. And top-level, state-of-the-art schools with well-trained faculty on par with schools in urban areas exist, as I mentioned earlier, but they remain in short supply in many rural regions, and sometimes that's due to lack of resources.
Lack of resources and having capable staff at municipal facilities is a big issue, but simply having adequate staff is another issue. And that brings up the issue of immigration, which we're going to talk about in a future podcast, but we can talk about it briefly here, which is, discussing in more detail how you're going to allow more immigrants into Japan and steer them toward residing in rural areas. It's only a limited number of people that are let in a short period of time for most of them. The government sees foreign labor as a stopgap instead of a permanent solution. Unfortunately, that doesn't solve Japan's persistent labor needs or entice highly skilled foreigners to choose Japan as a long-term destination. While new schemes offer a fast track to permanent residency, it's really only opened up to higher earners with advanced degrees. Even long-term visas, while easier to obtain than in the past, are given with the assumption that the people come and work and stay for maybe 5 years and then they leave. Many of Japan's training programs for immigrants are designed this way. Even long-term residents who have global income become subject to Japanese taxes. Global assets must be reported to the Japanese government, and the inheritance tax issue is so complicated. We could spend hours talking about it right now. So in short, the Japanese government is not making it easier for foreigners to immigrate.
This opens up a whole new can of worms. Can Japan attract global investment, attract global talent, and obtain resources that are essential to sustainable growth? The current system does not give me confidence that the government has an actionable plan in place. Just talking about global investment, Japan says the door is open, but it's far more complicated than that. Japan is the land where long-standing human relationships, or ningen kankei, oftentimes takes precedence over whether a deal is good or not. Publicly financed projects, while they are open bids on paper, are usually awarded to local known concerns, regardless of whether their bids are competitive or not. While not always the case, this trend discourages foreign players from even bothering to raise their hand and do the paperwork. And believe me, there's a lot of paperwork.
Sounds like you're the voice of experience there. Another structural issue is Japan's historical propensity to move slowly in decision-making as a whole. And so there's a question of how can Japan move more quickly to enact strategies and encourage competition. Traditional Japanese cultural norms, including the need to form group consensus while placing high importance on maintaining human relationships, ultimately inhibits debate on critical issues and, by nature, takes time that Japan honestly doesn't have in today's competitive global market.
At the same time, we're both here in Japan because we enjoy living here. So I don't think that we're trying to say that Japan should change its culture. However, the government clearly needs to move more rapidly and encourage more healthy competition. The Fukushima meltdown unfortunately confirmed that Japan's leaders are simply not ready to make fast decisions and effectively communicate to the public or the world in the midst of a crisis. David, you saw that firsthand. Rural revitalization is a perpetual crisis in need of speedy solutions, but I think we're seeing band-aids when surgery is what is needed.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you. I agree with you in terms of decision-making and the speed, but I also think there's reason for hope. I think young Japanese are more prone to thinking outside the box these days, and combined with technological innovations and non-Japanese who understand Japanese ways, there's every reason to think that the future will be more competitive for Japan. At least that's how I think. And at least we can envision a Japan where non-Japanese are embraced more deeply as actual partners in prosperity.
Thank you, David. In conclusion, I think we have arrived at the thesis that the Japanese government needs to constantly analyze which programs are working, which need modifications to work properly, and which are not working. As Marie Kondo says, if it brings you joy, keep it. If not, throw it away. Our discussion, in essence, boils down to this. If it delivers results, keep doing it, do more of it, and do it faster. But if the results don't materialize, stop wasting taxpayers' money. Of course, that is easier said than done when entrenched special interests and human relationships are involved. But rural revitalization does not have the luxury of time. There is just too much at stake. We named this podcast Japan Unleashed for a reason. As Japan optimists, we want to see growth and prosperity. Government initiatives are at the heart of this, and David and I both want to see meaningful progress that unleashes Japan's potential. The statistics suggest that rural revitalization is mission impossible. But as communication specialists, we strongly believe that creativity can beat data. Thank you for listening to Japan Unleashed. Stay tuned for our next episode, due out in 2 weeks, where we will discuss technology and health and how these tie into the rural revitalization issue. If you haven't already, you can subscribe to Japan Unleashed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to Japan Unleashed. See you in a couple weeks.